What if the person you overlooked every day could shatter everything you've worked for? At Greenwood and Associates, the executives draped in sharp suits walked with an air of undeniable confidence. They carried themselves with the kind of arrogance that comes from years of success. Their tailored clothes were a badge of status, their every step radiating power. Yet, amid all their poise, there was one thing they never noticed: the invisible workers, the ones who kept the company running behind the scenes. Among them was Ella Turner, the janitor, whose presence was barely acknowledged by the higher-ups. To them, she was nothing more than a faceless figure who swept the floors and emptied the trash, doing the work no one else wanted to do. She blended into the background, her navy blue uniform a symbol of the roles deemed insignificant, the ones that would never climb the ladder. But what they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that Ella Turner wasn't just a janitor. She was the founder and majority shareholder of Greenwood and Associates. It all started several years ago when the firm had just begun to gain traction. Ella, despite her health issues, had made the decision to step away from day-to-day operations. She handed the reins to her cousin, Luke Turner, who became the CEO. From the sidelines, Ella watched as the company grew, unnoticed and quiet. But now, after all these years, Ella was ready to find out if her company was still being run with the integrity she had originally instilled in it. The signs of corruption were clear, too clear. Ella wasn't naive. She knew what was happening, and it was only getting worse. The executives at the top had forgotten the values that had made Greenwood and Associates successful. Now they would learn just how costly their underestimation of those they deemed insignificant would be. Subscribe and enjoy the story. In the heart of San Francisco, nestled between towering glass skyscrapers, stood Greenwood and Associates. The consulting firm was renowned for its expertise in helping tech companies scale, known for its high-profile clients and lucrative deals. It attracted some of the best minds in the industry, promising opportunities and a taste of success. But beneath this glossy exterior was a stark reality. A company where those at the top enjoyed luxury, while the people who truly ran the show were left in the shadows, dismissed and ignored. Ella had always been the invisible force that powered the firm. Now, it was time for the ones at the top to feel her presence. The firm was known for helping companies scale, recognized for its high-profile clients and lucrative deals. The executives, those polished professionals, walked the halls with the weight of power in every step. It was a place where some of the best minds in the industry gathered, strategizing for success, sharing ideas, and building an empire of wealth and prestige. Yet, for all the success and status that surrounded the top-tier professionals at Greenwood and Associates, there was a stark divide. While the high-ranking executives strutted in their sharp suits and manicured appearances, those in the lower ranks, the janitorial staff, administrative workers, the unseen contributors, were often reduced to little more than cogs in the machine. Among them was Ella Turner, a name barely whispered within the firm's towering walls. To the management, she was just another employee, another face in the background. Ella had recently started working as a janitor at Greenwood, donning the standard navy blue uniform, her hair always neatly tied back in a simple ponytail, a cleaning cart her only companion as she moved through the building. She was an unnoticed figure, an invisible force, sweeping and mopping, doing the tedious tasks that no one else wanted to. Her presence was fleeting, blending into the background as everyone from the senior consultants to the executives passed by without a second thought. But what no one knew was that Ella Turner was far from ordinary. While she cleaned the floors, emptied the trash, and polished the windows, her mind wasn't focused on the mundane work she did. No, her thoughts were on the company she had built, the company that had grown into the powerhouse it was today, Greenwood and Associates. Years ago, after laying the groundwork and pouring her heart into establishing the firm, Ella had stepped back due to personal health issues, quietly handing over the daily operations to her cousin, Luke Turner, who became the CEO. She thought that stepping aside would give her the peace she needed, but it had only allowed the company's values to erode. Ella was watching. watching every move, watching every misstep. And soon, the ones at the top would learn that their underestimation of those they deemed insignificant could cost them everything. Ella wore the standard janitor's uniform, navy blue, with her hair always neatly tied back in a simple ponytail. A cleaning cart was her constant companion, wheels squeaking as she moved down the long, polished corridors. With each sweep of her broom, with each wipe of the window, she seemed to disappear further into the shadows. Ella Turner blended into the background, unnoticed by most, just another invisible worker among the sea of busy professionals. To the management, she was merely a faceless employee, a cog in the machine performing the menial tasks that no one else wanted to do. Ella. The name was spoken only in passing, when someone needed their office cleaned or the trash taken out. Her role was simple: clean, sweep, wipe, repeat. But there was something far more significant beneath her quiet exterior, something no one had ever suspected. What no one realized, what they had no way of knowing, was that Ella Turner was not just a janitor. In fact, she was the one who had built Greenwood and Associates from the ground up. Several years ago, after the firm had finally gained traction and established itself as a force in the consulting industry, Ella had made a difficult decision. Health issues forced her to step back from the daily grind of running the business. So, in a quiet but significant act, she handed over the reins to her cousin, Luke Turner, who assumed the role of CEO. Ella thought it was the best decision. Her cousin was capable, and he understood the company's values. But as the years passed, it became clear to Ella that the company had strayed from the principles that had made it successful. She had handed over the operations, yes, but she never truly let go. She watched from the sidelines, tracking every decision, every change. The company was thriving in some ways, but failing in others. The integrity she had built the firm on had started to crack. And now, after all this time, Ella was ready to see how deep the rot went. She had waited patiently, but her patience was wearing thin. For years, Ella had quietly stepped back from the spotlight, watching from the sidelines as the company she had painstakingly built grew into a corporate giant. Greenwood and Associates had once stood as a beacon of integrity, a company that operated with principles of fairness and respect. But now, as the years passed, it became increasingly clear to Ella that the very leaders she had entrusted with her vision had forgotten those core values. The whispers of greed and arrogance filtered through the office walls. The power struggles, the manipulation, the disrespect for those who had made the company what it was. It all pointed to a single conclusion. The company had strayed far from its roots. Ella was no fool. She knew she had to act, but she couldn't reveal herself just yet. The time wasn't right. She had spent far too many years in the background, observing, learning, and waiting for this moment to come. Now she needed to see just how deep the corruption ran, how far it had spread within her own company. Every day, Ella followed the same routine. She arrived early, long before the office came to life, before the hum of phone calls and the clatter of keyboards filled the air. The building was still, the halls empty. This was her time, her moment of quiet observation. With a cleaning cart in tow, she began her rounds through the towering glass corridors of the firm. She mopped the floors, wiping away the dirt and dust. But her focus wasn't on the cleanliness of the office. Her eyes were on the people. She watched the subtle interactions between employees, the way they walked, the way they spoke, the undercurrents of tension that flared when no one was looking. Her thoughts were always on the company, always on the state of it, even as she worked in silence. Ella knew she was invisible to the executives. They didn't look her way, didn't acknowledge her presence as she moved through the building. They saw her as nothing more than a fixture, a part of the office's routine. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that while they were busy building their empires, she had been watching them, silently assessing the damage done to her creation. And now, as the day grew closer for her to reveal her true self, Ella was ready to take action. But she had to make sure that when she did, it would be with precision. There was no room for mistakes. The company's future, and her own, depended on it. As Ella made her rounds, emptying wastebaskets and tidying up the offices, she couldn't help but observe the dynamics of the office. The high-rise offices, with their expansive glass windows and sleek modern conference rooms, stood in stark contrast to the humble cleaning cart she pushed through the halls. The polished floors and shiny windows were meticulously cleaned, but for Ella, it wasn't about making the building look pristine. It was about understanding the people who walked through it. To the executives, Ella was nothing more than a blur. A part of the office's background, almost as if she were a fixture, nothing of importance, invisible. But Ella didn't mind. She was keenly aware of her place in the grand scheme of things. What mattered was the power she had, the power she would soon reclaim. Her focus wasn't on the cleanliness of the floors or the gleam of the windows. It was on the people, the ones who walked through these halls, the ones who commanded the space and the resources. Her eyes often lingered on Liam Carter, the CEO of Greenwood and Associates, whose presence alone seemed to fill the room with an air of superiority. Liam was a man who carried arrogance with every step. Tall, impeccably dressed, and with a demeanor that oozed entitlement, he was the embodiment of privilege. Every time he passed by Ella, she could feel the disdain radiating off him. There was no regard for the people beneath him. He walked with his head held high, his every move calculated to exude power and dominance. Ella had observed him for months now, his arrogant swagger, his dismissive comments toward those who worked for him, especially the ones in lower positions. Liam treated everyone beneath him, from junior consultants to receptionists, with a condescending air as though they were less than human. But it wasn't just the way he treated others that bothered Ella. It was how he made her feel. She often witnessed the way Liam interacted with people in the office. He was never shy about showing his disdain for anyone he deemed unimportant. He spoke to the support staff with a cold, commanding tone, belittling them for the smallest of mistakes. His entire presence was an exercise in dominance. But what struck Ella the hardest wasn't just his treatment of others. It was how he treated her, a mere janitor, a figure beneath his notice. The contempt in his eyes whenever their paths crossed spoke volumes. It wasn't just dismissal, it was disrespect. Liam Carter's arrogance knew no bounds. He treated everyone beneath him with a sense of condescension, as if they were nothing more than obstacles in his path to success. Whether it was a junior consultant, a receptionist, or a janitor like Ella, they were all beneath him, mere footnotes in the corporate world he ruled. His dismissive behavior toward the office staff was blatant and unforgiving, as if their contributions meant nothing to the grand scheme of the business. But it wasn't just Liam. There was another figure in the company who shared his smug sense of superiority: Monica Hayes, the chief strategy officer. Monica, like Liam, walked through the office as if she owned it. She too held a belief that the support staff, the ones who kept the gears of the firm turning, were nothing more than tools for her to use and discard. Monica's behavior was no different from Liam's. She too saw those beneath her as obstacles to her rise. She treated everyone around her with a sharp edge, a coldness that was impossible to ignore. The support staff, in particular, were just pawns in her game. Whether it was a simple task or a small mistake, Monica's response was laced with disdain, always wrapped in the tone of a woman who felt entitled to every inch of the success she'd claimed. As Ella swept the hallway outside the executive offices, she couldn't help but overhear the conversation between Liam and Monica. They didn't care about the walls between them. Their voices were raised in confident arrogance, loud and clear for anyone to hear. Monica's voice rang out, dripping with contempt as she spoke to Liam. "I don't know how much longer we can afford to keep the janitorial staff around," Monica remarked, her words sharp and dismissive. "They can't even clean the offices properly. It's embarrassing for a firm of our caliber." Liam chuckled, his laughter mirroring the disdain in Monica's tone. "They're lucky to even have a job," he said, his voice tinged with superiority. "It's not like they could do anything else. We could always replace them." As Ella stood frozen in place, quietly listening, her heart sank. She had known that they looked down on her and others like her, but hearing it spoken so openly, so plainly, It was like a slap in the face. The company she had built, the values she had poured so much into, were being undermined by the very people she had trusted to carry the torch forward. But in that moment, as their words pierced her, Ella felt a fire stir inside her. A fire that had been dormant for far too long. It was time. Monica's voice cut through the silence of the hallway as she spoke to Liam, completely unaware that Ella was standing just a few feet away, quietly sweeping the floor. The conversation between the two executives was casual, almost dismissive, as if they had forgotten that people could hear them, the very people they so carelessly disparaged. "I don't know how much longer we can afford to keep the janitorial staff around," Monica said, her words dripping with disdain. "They don't even clean the offices properly. It's embarrassing for a firm of our caliber." Liam chuckled in agreement, the sound cold and void of empathy. "They're lucky to even have a job," he remarked, a sneer evident in his voice. "It's not like they could do anything else. We can always replace them." As Ella stood frozen in place, her hands gripping the broom handle tightly, she felt a wave of cold wash over her. Her heart sank, the weight of their words pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. She had expected this kind of behavior. She had seen the signs over the years. But hearing it so plainly spoken, so casually, was something she hadn't prepared for. This was no longer just about being overlooked. This was about a complete disregard for the people who had helped build the company, who had kept it running while the executives played their games of power. Monica and Liam spoke as if Ella and the others were nothing more than disposable objects, easily replaced without a second thought. The company she had built, the dream she had nurtured with her own hands, was being reduced to nothing more than a money-making machine, lacking the soul that had once driven it. The values she had instilled, the respect, the integrity, the hard work, had been washed away in the pursuit of profit. They had forgotten what made Greenwood and Associates more than just another firm. They had forgotten the people who had sacrificed for it. But in that moment, as the sting of their words sunk in, Ella realized something crucial. It was up to her to restore what had been lost. She had waited long enough, but now she understood. The time for waiting was over. The company Ella had built from the ground up, with hard work and determination, had fallen into the hands of people who no longer respected the very foundation it was built on. The values she had instilled, the respect for each individual, regardless of their rank or position, had been forgotten in favor of power, greed, and superiority. And now, standing there, invisible and unnoticed, Ella realized with startling clarity that it was up to her to restore that respect, to bring back the integrity that had once defined Greenwood and Associates. It was no longer a matter of observing from the sidelines. It was time to act. But the frustration weighed heavily on her. She continued her quiet observation, silently watching the daily happenings of the company as her heart grew heavier with each passing day. The once thriving ethical company she had built had become a hollow shell, ruled by arrogance and a toxic culture. But it wasn't just the arrogant behavior of Liam Carter, the CEO, that troubled her. It was how he treated everyone beneath him, especially the lower-ranking employees like herself. Liam's condescending attitude toward his staff had been apparent from the very beginning. He made no effort to hide his belief that the people working for him were subordinate, inferior to him in every way. It wasn't just his words that were belittling. It was in his every action, his every glance. Whether it was a simple offhand comment or a subtle gesture, he made it clear that those below him were nothing more than tools to serve his ambitions. But it wasn't just the junior consultants or the receptionists that Liam belittled. Ella felt it every day, the dismissive stares, the disrespectful comments under his breath, the way he seemed to treat her presence as an inconvenience rather than a human being. To him, she was just another part of the office, a nobody, nothing more than a janitor to be looked down upon. As Ella moved through the office, cleaning the halls, wiping down the conference rooms, she couldn't escape the feeling that something fundamental had been lost. The company she had worked tirelessly to build, with a focus on respect and fairness, was now being controlled by those who had forgotten the very principles it was founded on. The people she had entrusted with carrying the company forward had turned it into something unrecognizable. The weight of it all began to sink in, and Ella knew in her heart that if she wanted to reclaim Greenwood and Associates, she would have to confront the rot that had taken root at the top. She had been patient long enough, but now her resolve was clear. From the beginning, Liam's behavior toward the staff had been less than respectful. He belittled the junior consultants, mocking their efforts and openly blaming them for mistakes, even when they were out of their control. His condescending tone was a constant presence, an undercurrent that colored every interaction. It wasn't just a lack of respect, it was disdain. His actions created a hostile and intimidating work environment where employees lived in fear of making the slightest misstep, knowing that Liam would be waiting, ready to pounce. He used his position as CEO to make others feel small, to remind them of their place at the bottom of the corporate ladder. If anyone dared to challenge him, to voice an opinion that differed from his own, they were quickly dismissed, belittled, and silenced. There was no room for disagreement in Liam's world, only submission. His every word and action was designed to reinforce his dominance, ensuring that no one ever dared question him. But what disturbed Ella the most was how Liam started treating her. At first, she thought she was simply overreacting. After all, she was just the janitor, and he was the CEO. She convinced herself that perhaps she was reading too much into the situation, that his glances and comments were just part of his personality, part of his arrogance. But soon, Ella realized that his behavior was no longer just dismissive. It had crossed a line. What had once been subtle condescension was now overtly inappropriate, and it was becoming borderline harassment. Every time Liam passed by her, whether she was cleaning the hallways or working in the break room, she felt his eyes on her. It wasn't the casual glance of someone passing by. It was the predatory stare of someone who felt entitled to make her uncomfortable. His gaze lingered on her for just a moment too long, as if trying to assert his power, trying to make her feel like she was beneath him. But it wasn't just the looks. It was the comments, too. Each time he spoke to her, it felt like an attempt to belittle her even more. His words were wrapped in a thinly veiled mockery, his tone always dripping with superiority. At first, it seemed harmless enough, a passing remark here or there. But soon, it became clear that his behavior was intentional, that he was deliberately crossing boundaries he had no right to cross. Ella tried to brush it off at first, to ignore the discomfort growing in the pit of her stomach. But as the days went on, she couldn't escape the feeling that Liam was pushing her limits, testing just how much she would tolerate. In the break room, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Every time Ella was near Liam, she couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't right. He would stare at her in a way that made her skin crawl, his eyes lingering far too long, not just with disdain, but with something darker, more unsettling. It was a look that seemed to strip her of her dignity, as if she were nothing more than an object for him to inspect. It wasn't a glance that lasted just a second. It was a predatory gaze, slow and deliberate, like he was trying to assert some sort of power over her. But it wasn't just the looks. His comments began to take on a more personal, inappropriate tone. What started as a few passing jabs had grown into something far more uncomfortable. One morning, as Ella was mopping the floor outside his office, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She kept her head down, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the presence of Liam loomed near. Without warning, he suddenly stopped in his tracks, standing in her path. Ella's heart skipped a beat as she looked up. His eyes swept over her, moving from her head to her feet, assessing her as if she were nothing more than a spectacle. His smile was laced with arrogance, and the way he leaned closer to her, closer than was ever necessary, made her stomach churn. He pointed at a spot on the floor that Ella had already cleaned, his finger drawing an imaginary line on the floor. "Hey, Ella," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, as if she were a child being reprimanded. "You know, you could clean this place a bit better, especially when you're around someone as attractive as you." Ella si congelo. The words hit her like a slap across the face, and for a moment she could barely react. It wasn't just an insult to her work. It was a personal attack, a deliberate crossing of boundaries. He wasn't even pretending anymore to be a professional. His tone was suggestive, inappropriately so, and it made her skin crawl. Her breath caught in her throat as she fought to keep her composure. He didn't just question her cleaning ability, he had just turned her job into something shameful, using her presence to fulfill his own twisted sense of superiority. "Sorry, Liam," Ella said, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "I'll check it again." But the discomfort didn't end there. Liam wasn't done. His body shifted closer, and his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, lingered on her, as if daring her to resist him. "You know," he continued, his voice lowering to a whisper that only she could hear, "someone as pretty as you shouldn't be stuck cleaning. I could make sure you get a better position here, a more fitting one, if you just cooperate, of course." Ella's heart raced. The words stung, but they also infuriated her. He wasn't just insulting her ability, he was using his position to manipulate her. The line between professional and personal had been crossed. The subtle harassment she had once dismissed had now become an explicit attempt to control her. Ella's mind screamed to push him away, to tell him to back off, but she knew she had to hold it together. She forced a smile, hiding the disgust building inside her. "I'm happy with my job, thank you," she replied firmly, though her voice was shaking inside. Liam, still grinning, seemed to enjoy the discomfort he was causing her. He patted her shoulder in a way that felt like ownership, as if he had claimed her presence, like she was nothing more than a tool for his amusement. As Ella stood there, trying to steady her breath, she knew that this couldn't go on. His harassment, his manipulation, had crossed the line, and it was no longer something she could tolerate. She had stayed silent long enough, but now, more than ever, it was clear. It was time to take action. Liam's words hit Ella like a sharp slap to the face. "You know, you could clean this place a bit better, especially when you're around someone as attractive as you." Ella seconded low, shocked. The suggestiveness in his tone was unmistakable, and it made her stomach churn. It wasn't just a jab at her work anymore. He had crossed a line. What had started as subtle condescension had now turned into something deeply uncomfortable and personal. His words weren't just about cleaning anymore. They were an attack on her as a person, her worth reduced to nothing more than her appearance. Her pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, Ella found herself frozen in place, unable to respond. Her mind raced, trying to process the situation, but she forced herself to remain composed. She smiled, though it was tight, forced, and as far from genuine as it could be. "Sorry, Liam." "I'll check it again," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the surge of disgust building up inside her. The words felt hollow, like she was playing along in a game she didn't want to be part of. She hated it. But Liam wasn't done. He took another step closer, moving into her personal space in a way that made her feel trapped. His gaze never left her, his eyes lingering on her with that predatory look, the kind that made her skin crawl. His smile was wide, almost menacing, as if he knew the power he held over her and reveled in it. "You know," he continued, his voice lower now, a whisper meant only for her, "someone as pretty as you shouldn't be stuck cleaning. I could make sure you get a better position here, a more fitting one. If you just cooperate, of course." Ella felt the blood drain from her face. His words were unmistakable now. He wasn't just insulting her work, he was trying to manipulate her, using his position as CEO to make her feel small, to make her feel like she owed him something. His tone was sickeningly smooth, as though he thought she would be flattered, as though she should be grateful for his attention. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a wave of anger rise inside her. She had worked hard for everything she had, everything she had built. And this man, this arrogant, disgusting man, was trying to use his power to take advantage of her. For a brief moment, Ella wanted to lash out, to tell him exactly what she thought of him. But she held herself back. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. She was biding her time. The moment for confrontation would come, but not right now. Instead, she forced a smile again, this time more tightly than before, and backed away from him. "I'm happy with my job. Thank you," she said, her voice colder this time, steadfast. She refused to let him see the panic he was trying to instill in her. But even as she spoke, she knew the time for patience was almost up. Liam smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. But Ella was done playing along. As she turned on her heel and walked away, she made a promise to herself. This would end soon. Liam's words hung in the air, his voice now low and smooth, almost predatory. "Someone as pretty as you shouldn't be stuck cleaning. I could make sure you get a better position here, a more fitting one. If you just cooperate, of course." Ella's heart raced. She felt an instant surge of anger rush through her, followed by a wave of humiliation. The audacity of his words, his complete disregard for her as a person, his attempt to use his power to manipulate her. It all hit her like a punch to the gut. For a moment, she was frozen. She could feel the fire of outrage rising in her chest. She wanted to shout at him, to tell him exactly how disgusting he was. She wanted to walk up to him, look him in the eye, and say everything she had been holding back. But she couldn't. Not yet. Instead, Ella forced herself to remain calm. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the discomfort threatening to bubble over. She couldn't let him see how much his words had affected her. She couldn't show him how deeply he had disrespected her. So she pushed the anger and humiliation down, locking it inside, and gave him a steady look. "I'm happy with my job, thank you," she said firmly, keeping her voice level despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. The words felt cold, controlled, exactly how she needed to sound. But inside, she was anything but calm. Anger, disgust, and a growing sense of determination surged through her. This was no longer just about cleaning floors or being ignored. It was about Liam using his power to manipulate her. He wasn't just demeaning her work, he was using his position to try to take advantage of her. And in that moment, Ella realized just how far this man was willing to go. He had crossed a line, one that she couldn't ignore anymore. He thought he could get away with this because of the power he held. But Ella wasn't going to let him. She turned, walking away from him without another word, her back straight, her steps deliberate. Ella stood still, feeling the weight of Liam's smirk burn into her skin. He was clearly enjoying the power he held over her, savoring the discomfort he caused. His smirk wasn't just a sign of satisfaction. It was a mark of ownership, as if he had the right to control her, to bend her to his will. Without a second thought, he reached out and patted her on the shoulder, the touch lingering just a little too long. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It felt like an act of dominance, a reminder that he could do whatever he wanted, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. The touch was possessive, like she was a thing to be owned, not a person with dignity and rights. Ella's teeth clenched, her body rigid with suppressed anger. The urge to turn around, to lash out at him, was overwhelming. She could feel her fists tightening, the sting of humiliation and rage bubbling just beneath the surface. But as much as she wanted to scream, as much as she wanted to slap him and tell him exactly what she thought of him, she held herself back. Not yet. She knew that she had to wait, that the time for confrontation hadn't come. There was too much at stake. She had to be careful, strategic. But the day was fast approaching when she would no longer stay silent. Liam had pushed her to the edge, and she was reaching her breaking point. She could only endure this harassment for so long. Each day, his inappropriate comments grew bolder, more shameless. The feeling of powerlessness that came with his advances, the knowledge that he thought he could say and do anything he pleased, was becoming unbearable. Every glance, every word, every gesture felt like a constant reminder that he thought he could break her, control her, and she couldn't fight back. But one evening, as Ella finished her rounds and was preparing to leave the office, Liam approached her again. After finishing her rounds cleaning the executive floors, Ella was preparing to leave, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the office. But as she made her way to the parking garage, she was caught off guard. The familiar feeling of unease crept up her spine when she saw Liam standing in front of her, blocking her path. The air between them was thick with tension, heavy with the unspoken weight of his intentions. He stood too close, as if he was trying to assert his control over her in the most personal way. His once confident, polished demeanor had shifted. His expression, once casual and aloof, now carried an unsettling predatory edge. Ella's breath hitched, her body instinctively taking a step back. But Liam was already moving toward her, closing the space between them with every step. "Ella," he said, his voice now low and almost hypnotic, as if he were savoring every word. "You've been working so hard lately. I've been thinking, maybe you deserve something more than this cleaning job." The words made her stomach turn, a cold shiver running down her spine. He was offering her something more, but it was clear now that it came at a price. He took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "There's a place for you here," he continued, his voice smooth and persuasive. "You just need to be a little more cooperative." His tone left no room for doubt. Cooperative. He meant submitting to him, giving him what he wanted in exchange for a better position. The manipulation was clear now. It wasn't about Ella's work ethic or her value to the company. It was about his desire to control her. He was offering her something more, but only on his terms, with his power hanging over her like a dark cloud. Ella's heart pounded in her chest. The blood roared in her ears as her fight-or-flight instinct screamed at her. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to escape him. But instead, she stood still, frozen for a moment, caught between fear and anger. Ella's heart raced as the full weight of Liam's words sank in. His intentions, now unmistakably clear, hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a proposition anymore. It was an ultimatum. His words were laced with a threat, a veiled promise that if she didn't comply with his demands, her job, the one she had fought so hard for, would be on the line. "I could make sure you're not here much longer," he continued, his voice smooth but dark, dripping with manipulation. The chill that ran down her spine wasn't from the cold air of the parking garage. It was the realization that Liam wasn't just offering her a position, he was demanding her submission in exchange for her career. The stakes were higher now, and his words carried a finality that made her stomach churn with disgust. "You won't have a chance anywhere else," he added, stepping even closer, his presence overwhelming. His breath was hot on her neck, sending a wave of revulsion through her. "Not with your lack of experience, but if you listen to me, I could set you up with something better." His tone was smooth, enticing, but there was a sinister undercurrent to his words. "Don't make this harder on yourself." Every part of her wanted to step back, to break free from the suffocating grip of his power. The urge to run, to escape this man and his predatory behavior, was overwhelming. Her stomach churned with disgust, and she could feel the heat of anger rising within her chest. This was no longer just about her job. It was about her dignity, her autonomy, and the respect she deserved as a human being. But Ella didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her back straight as she faced him. Her eyes narrowed, filled with a quiet resolve. She knew this was the moment where she could no longer stay silent, where she had to take a stand. "You've crossed the line, Liam," she said, her voice calm but steadfast. She wasn't backing down, not anymore. This was the moment Ella had been waiting for, the moment to finally take action. Enough was enough. The weight of Liam's threats, his manipulation, and his arrogance had been too much to bear, and Ella knew it was time to confront him, to put an end to this toxic power he had been wielding over her. She looked him dead in the eye, not a hint of fear in her gaze, her voice steady and cold. "Liam, if you keep this up, you'll regret it," she said, her words sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Her tone was full of warning, unwavering, as though she knew the consequences of this moment better than he did. Liam's face twisted with surprise, his arrogance momentarily faltering as his confidence wavered. For the first time, he seemed unsure, his usual self-assuredness shaken, like a predator unsure of how to deal with the person he had been stalking. "What are you?" Liam began, but before he could finish, Ella interrupted him, her voice unwavering and firm. "You've crossed the line," she said, her words leaving no room for argument. "And if you try this again, I'll make sure you never step foot in this building again." For a brief moment, Liam seemed taken aback, his usual self-assurance faltering. The smirk that usually adorned his face was gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He stood there, staring at Ella for the first time at a loss for words. But Ella knew this was just the beginning. Her calm demeanor belied the intensity of the storm that was brewing within her. She had been patient, observing, waiting for the right moment, and now it was here. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her anymore. The game had changed, and Ella was no longer going to be the one to back down. The moment had come. The intimidation, the threats, the relentless attempts to use his power to control her, it had all gone too far. For far too long, Ella had played the part of the quiet, unseen employee. But no more. She wasn't going to play along any longer. With that, she turned on her heel, not even sparing Liam another glance, and walked toward the elevator. Her steps were purposeful, her back straight, as if every inch of her body was declaring that she was done with the games. The weight of everything she had endured in silence, all the indignities, the harassment, and the disrespect, was now lifted. She knew the time for patience was over. It was time to show Liam, and the entire company, who she truly was, and to take back control of what had always been rightfully hers. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, but Ella's resolve was anything but soft. The next morning, Ella walked into the office, but she didn't walk in as the janitor. She didn't walk in as the invisible employee who had been overlooked and belittled. Ella Turner walked into the office as the CEO. She was dressed in a tailored suit, sharp and confident. Her hair, once tied back in the simple style of a janitor, was now styled neatly, each strand in place, giving her an air of professionalism and authority that commanded attention. She carried herself with the same confidence that had once only been seen in the likes of Liam and the other executives. Self-assured, unwavering, and ready to take back what was hers. As she passed through the lobby, she felt the stares of the employees who had once ignored her, who had never thought twice about the janitor they passed every day. Today they stared at her in awe. The same employees who had once looked past her were now looking at her, some even with a hint of recognition dawning on their faces. Liam and Monica, sitting in the boardroom preparing for a meeting, were the first to see her enter. Their eyes widened in disbelief, their mouths hanging slightly open as they tried to process what they were seeing. Ella moved toward the head of the table, standing confidently beside her cousin, Luke, the true CEO. She didn't wait for them to speak. She didn't need to. "This is Ella Turner," Luke announced proudly, gesturing to her with a beaming smile. "The founder and majority shareholder of Greenwood and Associates." The room fell into stunned silence. Ella's confidence was a stark contrast to the quiet janitor she had once been. The sharpness of her tailored suit and the way she carried herself exuded the same authority and poise that she had witnessed in Liam and Monica. As she passed through the lobby, the same employees who had once ignored her, who had never given her a second thought, now stared at her in awe. The change in her was undeniable. She no longer blended into the background. She stood out. The energy in the office shifted as she moved through the halls. There was a palpable sense of confusion, wonder, and even a touch of fear in the air. They didn't know her as the janitor anymore. They were beginning to realize that they were witnessing the unveiling of someone far more powerful. Meanwhile, Liam and Monica, sitting in the boardroom preparing for a meeting, didn't notice her at first. They were caught up in their discussion, unaware of the shift happening right under their noses. But as Ella made her way toward the room, they both felt the change in the atmosphere. Something felt different. It wasn't until she entered the boardroom that they finally noticed her. Their gazes flickered briefly, not yet recognizing the woman walking toward them. But as she made her way to the head of the table, their eyes widened in disbelief. When she stood beside her cousin Luke, the true CEO, the full realization hit them. For a moment, neither Liam nor Monica could speak. Their faces turned pale, their expressions caught between confusion and shock. The woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a janitor was now standing before them, not as an employee, but as the owner of the very company they had worked for. "This is Ella Turner," Luke announced proudly, his voice filled with pride as he gestured to her, the founder and owner of Greenwood and Associates. The room fell into an eerie silence. The employees, the ones who had once overlooked Ella, now looked at her with a mix of awe, confusion, and newfound respect. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant. Liam's usual swagger was gone, replaced by a visible disorientation, and Monica's smug confidence faltered. For the first time, they were no longer in control. The woman they had ignored, underestimated, and humiliated had just claimed her rightful place at the top. The room was plunged into stunned silence. For a few moments, no one dared to speak. The shock of the revelation hung in the air like a heavy fog. Liam's expression shifted from utter confusion to disbelief, his face paling as the reality of the situation settled in. He stood up quickly, as if trying to regain some semblance of control, but for the first time, his usual confidence faltered. The mask of arrogance he had worn so comfortably was slipping. What is this?" he stammered, his voice cracking as he glanced between Ella and Luke, who stood beside her. His eyes were wide with shock, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. This has to be a joke." He laughed nervously, but it was clear he wasn't sure whether he was laughing out of disbelief or fear. "You're the janitor? Are you telling me you've been—" Ella didn't give him a chance to finish. Her voice cut through the air, calm and steady, as she interrupted him with the same quiet authority she had maintained throughout this entire moment. There was no hesitation in her words, no stammering, only a sense of certainty and control. "Yes, Liam. I've been working undercover as a cleaner, observing the company firsthand." Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering and intense. Ella didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She wasn't the same woman who had once been dismissed and belittled by him. The person standing before him now was the owner of the company, and she would not be intimidated. She would not back down. "And what I found," she continued, her voice cold and clear, "was disturbing." The words hung in the air like a threat. Liam's face shifted again, his confusion now giving way to something else: fear. His previous bravado was slipping, replaced by the unmistakable realization that he was no longer in control of the situation. Ella's gaze hardened as she continued, her words sharp and to the point. "You've harassed me, Liam. You've mistreated employees, and you've abused your power to manipulate people, all while pretending to uphold the values of this company." Each accusation was deliberate, each word laced with the weight of years of built-up anger and betrayal. Ella's words struck like a final verdict, each one heavier than the last. "You've harassed me, Liam. You've mistreated employees, and you've failed to uphold the values this company was built on." Liam's face flushed with anger, his jaw tightening as his pride began to boil over. But underneath the rage, there was something else: fear. A flicker of it was visible in his eyes, a quick moment of realization that he was no longer in control. The arrogant, confident CEO who had once looked down on everyone, who had been the face of power, was now shrinking before the very woman he had dismissed. He took a step back, his mind scrambling to make sense of the situation, but his arrogance quickly dissolved into panic. For the first time in his life, Liam was completely out of his depth, and the power he had so long taken for granted was slipping from his grasp. This can't be happening," he blurted, his voice trembling with disbelief. "You can't do this. I'm the CEO here. But Ella wasn't done. Her voice grew colder, harder, cutting through his protest like a blade. "Not anymore," she said, her words firm and unyielding. "Effective immediately, you're fired, and legal action will follow." The weight of her statement hit Liam like a ton of bricks. His usually polished demeanor was now gone, replaced by a man who was disoriented, completely unmoored from the reality he had built for himself. His hands trembled as he stood there, struggling to regain his footing. "Ella, please," he pleaded, his voice now soft and desperate, almost pleading for mercy. "You can't do this to me. Please." His usual self-assurance was completely shattered, and in its place was a man who realized just how much he had underestimated her. For a brief moment, the confident CEO of Greenwood and Associates seemed like a mere shadow of the arrogant figure he had once been. Liam's voice was shaky, his attempt to regain control over the situation only highlighting his weakness. The arrogance that had once defined him was now nowhere to be found. His previous confidence had crumbled under the weight of Ella's decision. "You can't! This isn't right! Liam started, his voice faltering as he tried to assert himself. But Ella silenced him with a single, cold glance. Her gaze was unwavering, like ice, cutting through his desperation. "No more chances, Liam," she said, her voice steady and sharp, filled with the authority of someone who had made up their mind. "You had your opportunity, and you abused it. You're done here." The finality of her words settled in the room like a heavy stone. There was no room for negotiation, no space for argument. Ella had made her decision, and there was no turning back. Liam's face turned a deep shade of red, a mixture of embarrassment, rage, and humiliation flooding his features. His pride, once so fiercely intact, was now bruised, the very foundation of his power shattered. He was no longer the man who had walked through these halls with arrogance and entitlement. Now, he was the man who had been exposed, stripped of his position, and left to confront the consequences of his actions. But even as he stood there, feeling the weight of his loss, he couldn't entirely suppress his resentment. With a venomous sneer, he muttered, "You'll regret this." But his words lacked the strength they had once held. There was little conviction in his voice, just the hollow echo of a man who had lost everything. Ella, however, was unshaken. She met his gaze head-on, her expression unwavering. She didn't flinch, didn't back down in the face of his empty threat. "I highly doubt that," she said, her voice low, but filled with the strength of someone who knew their truth and their power. Liam stood there, his face still flushed with anger and disbelief, but hesitation crept into his expression as he realized the full extent of the situation. His arrogance had vanished, leaving only the crumbling remnants of the man he had once been. "I highly doubt that," Ella replied, her voice calm, but cutting through the silence like a razor. There was no room for doubt in her words. Liam's time was up, and nothing could change that now. As the last word left her mouth, security moved in. Liam's defeat was swift and final. He was escorted out of the room. Each step he took a painful reminder that the power he had wielded so confidently just moments before had evaporated in an instant. His head hung low, his body language defeated, and as he was led away, there was no longer the proud CEO that had once dominated the room. He was simply a man being escorted out of the building, his control lost forever. The room remained eerily silent, the weight of Ella's words hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. The employees, many of whom had watched Liam's rise and fall, were left in stunned silence, unsure of what would come next. But one thing was clear. Ella had taken charge. She turned to face the rest of the management team, her gaze sweeping across the room, assessing the faces that had long been part of the toxic culture she was about to dismantle. They were no longer in control. They were on trial. "For those of you who have acted with integrity, your jobs are secure," Ella said, her tone measured, but firm. She wasn't here to make empty promises, but she understood the importance of loyalty and decency in a workplace. Her eyes locked with several of the board members who had remained quiet, who had stayed true to the company's values. They were safe, for now. But for those of you who have contributed to this toxic culture, there will be consequences. Ella's words were like a verdict, final and absolute. The air in the room grew thick with tension as the realization hit the rest of the team. Those who had turned a blind eye, who had enabled the corruption, were not going to escape unscathed. In a moment of complete clarity, several board members and managers were dismissed on the spot. Security moved swiftly to escort them out of the building, their departure marked by the sudden silence that fell over the room. They had become nothing more than a stain on the company, one that Ella was determined to erase. The room remained still, the shift in power undeniable. Ella had taken control of the company once again, and she wasn't afraid to purge it of those who had tarnished its values. As the remaining employees watched, Ella's presence in the room was undeniable. The company had just experienced a massive shakeup, and there was no mistaking who was now in control. She turned to address them, her voice calm yet powerful, carrying the weight of someone who had just taken back what was rightfully hers. Greenwood and Associates will now be a place of respect, innovation, and integrity, she declared, her words firm and resolute. This is the company I built, and it will thrive again under the right leadership. The room was still, the gravity of her words sinking in as the employees began to realize the profound change taking place. Under Ella's guidance, the company would no longer be a place where power was abused, where disrespect was the norm, or where the toxic culture that had corrupted its foundation was allowed to thrive. As she spoke, Ella's eyes scanned the room. The employees who had once ignored her, dismissed her, and walked past her without a second thought, now looked up to her with newfound respect. They saw her for who she truly was, the founder, the visionary, the one who had never given up on this company, even when it had lost its way. The toxic culture that had once dominated the workplace had been eradicated. The fear, the condescension, the manipulation, all of it was gone. What remained was a company that would now operate on the core values of respect, hard work, and a commitment to honesty. A company that would no longer be defined by power struggles or egos, but by the collective effort of everyone who believed in its true purpose. And just like that, the office atmosphere shifted. The air felt lighter, the tension that had once filled the halls now replaced with the quiet hum of productivity. People spoke to each other with genuine respect. There was an energy that hadn't existed for years, and it was all because of the change at the top. As Ella sat in her office later that day, reflecting on the journey she had just undertaken, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The company she had built from the ground up had nearly been lost, consumed by the very people she had trusted to protect it. But now, with the right leadership, the company was on the path to recovery. Under her guidance, it would flourish again. As Ella sat back in her chair, looking out over the city skyline from her office, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey she had just undertaken. The company she had built from the ground up was now in good hands. Her own, her patience, her persistence, and her quiet strength had led her to this moment. It hadn't been easy. She had watched the storm brew from the sidelines, knowing that change was necessary but waiting for the right moment to act. That moment had finally come. And when it did, Ella had struck with precision, reclaiming what was hers and restoring the integrity of a company that had strayed so far from its roots. Ella had always known that Greenwood and Associates wasn't just a business, it was her creation. She had built it not only with sharp business acumen, but with a deep sense of purpose. This company had never been just about profits and success for her. It had been about creating a space where hard work, respect, and integrity were valued above all else. As she reflected on the path that had brought her here, Ella felt a quiet satisfaction. She had built Greenwood from the ground up, facing challenges, setbacks, and disappointments, but never losing sight of the principles that had guided her. Even when the company had fallen into the hands of those who had forgotten its values, she had never lost faith in what it could become. Now, as the rightful leader of the company, she was ready to steer it back on course, and under her leadership, Greenwood would thrive, not just as a business, but as a place where the values of honesty, hard work, and respect would once again be the foundation of everything they did. Ella had always believed that Greenwood and Associates should be a place where hard work, respect, and fairness were at the core of everything they did. These values were the foundation upon which the company was built. To see it consumed by greed and arrogance, the very things that had led to its corruption, had been painful, but in a way, it had also been necessary. She had needed to witness the full extent of the company's decline to understand the depths of the corruption that had taken hold. It was only by seeing the company in this state that she could truly grasp what needed to be done. The rot ran deep, but so did her resolve. Ella knew that, in order to reclaim what was rightfully hers, she had to confront the damage head-on and rebuild from the ashes. As she leaned back in her chair, the weight of her thoughts softened slightly as she gazed out over the San Francisco skyline. The city, with its towering buildings and bright lights, felt like the perfect reflection of the new beginning she was about to forge. She couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had done it. She had taken back control of her company. But the work ahead of her was far from finished. She knew it would be a long and daunting road. There was a company to rebuild, a culture to transform, and above all, the trust of her employees to earn back. She had watched silently for years, but now, as the one in charge, she would need to demonstrate that she could restore the integrity and values that had been lost. It wouldn't be easy, but Ella was ready. She had built this company once, and now, with renewed purpose and determination, she would build it again, stronger, more resilient, and true to its roots. Ella knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. There was no doubt about that. There never was when rebuilding something from the ground up. But for the first time in years, she felt truly in control, not just of the company, but of her own destiny. The weight of the decisions she had made, the power she had reclaimed, filled her with an immense sense of purpose. She wasn't just restoring a business. She was restoring a company built on values that had been lost. Under her leadership, Greenwood and Associates would no longer be a place where power was abused, where people were ignored, or where integrity was an afterthought. The culture that had allowed greed and arrogance to flourish would be replaced by one that valued honesty, respect, and innovation. Ella knew the company could thrive again, but this time, it would thrive for the right reasons. It would be a place where everyone, from the lowest employee to the highest executive, was valued, respected, and given the opportunity to succeed on merit. As she sat back in her chair, a familiar buzz came from her phone. It was a message from Luke. She smiled as she read it. "We're in this together. Let's rebuild." Luke's words were simple, but they carried the weight of a partnership that would see them through the toughest times ahead. With him by her side, Ella felt even more certain that they could rebuild Greenwood into something better, something that stayed true to its original values. Her resolve was firm. The storm was over, and this time, the company would flourish, not just because of its profits, but because it would be built on the right foundation. Ella sat back in her chair, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She had done what many thought impossible. The company would thrive again, not just because of profit or success, but because it would now be built on the right values: honesty, respect, and integrity. These values would serve as the foundation, guiding every decision, every action, every future step. Karma, Ella thought with a quiet smile, always finds its way back. She had waited, observed, and endured for so long, and now, the company she had once built and had almost lost was in good hands, her hands. She had reclaimed what was hers, and in doing so, had not only saved her company, but had also restored the integrity that made it stand out in the first place. The storm was over, and now the company would begin its new journey, one rooted in the values that had always defined it. "Thank you for watching until the end." Ella's voice echoed in the quiet of the room, her tone filled with genuine gratitude. "I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories.